A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
Hey, they've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, the Horrible Deplorable, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Well, I think the most interesting news of the week was what happened around Google and this Harvard PhD employee who wrote a 10-page memo pushing back on some of the actions that Google takes to achieve its diversity goals. So, first of all, it must be said that the memo is entirely rational and scientific and cites a bunch of studies that back up his claim, essentially that men and women are biologically different and that could explain disproportionate outcomes. So his suggestion was never that women shouldn't be in tech or that there shouldn't be programs to encourage women to come into tech. He was simply pushing back on the idea that a 50-50 goal would only make sense if men and women were identical. And that once you accept that there are sex differences, then you're forced to confront the idea that men and women may make different choices based on those sex differences. So there will be some women who will choose professions that may be dominated by men, and there will be some men that will choose professions that are dominated by women. But if the goal is to try to get 50-50 representation in every profession, that ignores biological differences between men and women in what their goals are, what interests them, what their natural abilities are, and on and on and on.
And what did he get for this common sense approach?
Well, he got fired.
Wonderful.
I'm titling this section, First They Came for the AltRight. So Airbnb has announced that any attendees of the AltRight conference in Charlottesville, North Carolina, will be identified as much as they can and then removed as users from Airbnb. So the company Airbnb, and they put out a statement where they made it clear that they have no shame about this at all, has made it very clear that if they find your politics to be odious, if they disagree with your politics, then they will remove you from their service. This was very disappointing for me. I did some traveling around the world for a couple of years earlier in this decade, and I used Airbnb a lot. It was a wonderful discovery for me when I was already living in Italy, and I came to understand how Airbnb works because I was looking for a place to go to next. And using Airbnb, I ended up in Greece at a really nice place in Athens, not very far from the Acropolis. And I began then to use Airbnb as I traveled around Europe, basically when I was in Europe. And I had wonderful experiences with the homeowner or apartment owners who rented to me, and I thought the service was fabulous. And to have them essentially use that power to push a political agenda is really disappointing.
So what comes next? I mean, is United or American Airlines going to prevent alt-right people from flying in their airline seats?
Yeah, when people say, well, a private company can do whatever they want, I think it's worth remembering a couple things. One is private bakers were not allowed to not bake a cake for gay couples. So we're either going to have rules for everyone or not. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If it's the left's intention to push this idea that if you have a company that you must service all customers, then this needs to include politics as well. If the baker has to bake the cake for the gay couple, then Airbnb has to let alt-right people use the service, period. And if the argument is, no, we want a private company like Airbnb to be able to push their own leftist goals, okay, then the bakers don't have to bake the cake. We're going to have one set of rules. And as long as we continue down this path of having two set of rules, that's a recipe for civil war. You're going to tear the country apart. The whole point of a constitution and constitutional principles is that they apply across the board. I'm going to talk a little bit later in this podcast about how the elites are exempting themselves from basic constitutional principles too. But wherever that's happening, if it happens with consistency, it will absolutely tear the country apart. People will not live for very long in a system with multiple castes. I mean, they might in places where it's historically been happening, say in India, but even in India, there's a lot of pushback against that and a lot of pressure to reform. People are not going to tolerate regression. People are not going to tolerate a rolling back of their rights, especially rights they've enjoyed for centuries. And so we've got some decisions to make. So the alt-right decision that Airbnb made, and made unapologetically, was followed within a week by Google's decision to fire this employee. And they initially made a statement that was sort of pro-diversity of opinions, and then they got so much pushback from the Harridans inside their company, the cat ladies, that they eventually fired the guy and then issued a statement which was in direct contradiction to the original statement they'd made celebrating diversity of opinion. Of course, the guy, James Damore, who wrote the piece, even predicted, I mean, one of his complaints was that there's no tolerance for a diversity of opinion within Google. And then within 48 hours, 72 hours, Google essentially proves his point by firing him. And not just firing him, but again, just like Airbnb, doing it in a very public way, in an unapologetic way, with a statement that says we have no concerns about what we have done. We think it's the righteous thing to do. I will point out that when private companies, i.e. Hollywood studios, were choosing to fire or to not be associated with people who had been or continued to be members of the Communist Party, that was a perfectly legal and legitimate thing to do at the time, but it got spun by the left as a blacklist. That this was a horrible period in American history in which human beings were blacklisted for their opinions, and they were denied the right to work because of their political opinions. I ask you now, did the left really ever care about that principle? Because here we are 50 years later, and the blacklisting of people who hold non-left positions is happening with regularity, and it is happening without shame. It's not happening in the dark of night. They're not trying to come up with sort of other clever excuses for why they're letting people go. They're making it very clear. We are firing these people. We are denying service to these people because of their political opinions. And the left has no problem with it. Listen to the crickets.
So all those listeners out there who have Gmail accounts, do we really want to stay with Google?
We do have to start making some decisions about getting free of Google. I myself have a Gmail account. I took some advice on Twitter, and I've stopped using the Google Chrome app on my phone. I'm going to do this in baby steps because I'm not technologically the most sophisticated person, so I need to take this in steps. But I've stopped using the Chrome app on my phone, and I downloaded Firefox, which I already use on my computer, and so I'm now using the Firefox on my phone, and I added this DuckDuckGo, which is a better search engine, a cleaner search engine that doesn't track or monitor all of your decisions. And you can incorporate that into the browser. Once you've downloaded DuckDuckGo, you can choose to incorporate it into the Firefox or whatever browser you're using. And so essentially now, whenever I am using Twitter and I click on a article and it opens it up in a browser, I'm choosing Firefox. And when I do searches, and I do a lot of internet searches because I'm constantly curious about things, I'm like many of you, I'm sure, it's now DuckDuckGo. So I've divorced myself on my phone from one app, although the phone itself, I believe, is a Google phone. I think the Verizon phone that I'm using has a lot of Google products on it. So I will be, I'm probably another year or two on this phone, but I'm committed at this point that when I change phones, it's not going to be a Google associated phone. And that may mean that yours truly has to go to an iPhone. I have never owned an Apple product in my life. I'm not a fan. I don't necessarily have anything against them. It's just been kind of a trend that I never, a train I never got on. I never really cared about Apple products. But if that's what it takes to get away from Google, not that I think Apple's much better, but I need to, I realize that when I buy my next phone, I need to make a decision that is not connected to Google, so I'll have to do my research on that. Baby steps. Eventually, I do need to get rid of the Gmail account. Of course, when you make these decisions to switch phone carrier or to move away from somebody like Google, it's difficult because you have your whole address book and everything. And I know there are people out there right now who are saying it's not difficult at all. You can download all that stuff and then reload it. But for those of us who are not particularly tech savvy, making a decision to switch to an entirely different carrier or to an entirely different email system seems very daunting, because I want to make sure that people who have my email address know about the new one and that it's seamless. And again, I can hear the techies out there going, this is so easy. This is so easy to do. But most of us, and I put myself in that category, are not savvy enough to not be intimidated by that process. But it's on my mind and I am making the switch. What about you, Doris? I know you have a Gmail account.
Yeah, I mean, my son always advises me against Microsoft products, but it makes me wonder what you can use out there that is safe and that isn't going to turn on you like Google has turned on us.
There are alternative products. I know many of you are thinking of them or shouting them out right now while you're listening. This whole issue with Google has me wanting to make another point about it's a point about our elites, but I want to talk specifically about CEOs. This Indian CEO of Google who cut his vacation short so that he could come back and deal with this drama and fire this Google employee, right? So this elite who makes millions of dollars, and I'm sure vacations in the most elite resorts, cut that vacation with his family short so that he could fly in his private jet back to San Francisco and fire some lowly Google employee, Harvard PhD dude, who's toiling away in his business. The mainstream media and our elites don't think this is strange at all, that this elite would go out of his way, essentially climb down off his mountain to crush an ant underneath his shoe, and to make a big production out of it, issue a press release, and to make it seem like, he's made some big I've cut short my vacation to come home and do this. This almost has a feeling of an aristocracy. Like the king had to return by ship in order to watch the beheading of some commoner who was guilty of stealing bread. It's just ridiculous. And this idea that CEOs are brave or that they are leaders in any way, shape, or form is a non-starter. I've witnessed, we've talked before about, I've been involved in some of the school reform issues, and so I've watched what I call the dance of the superintendents. This happens most especially in urban school districts where somebody will be hired. They'll come in, they'll serve as the superintendent, usually for about 3 years, sometimes as much as 5 years, and then they're gone. And it's what I call the dance of the superintendents. These jobs usually pay $200,000 to $400,000 a year, and they're all public employee retirement system type jobs. And so essentially, the elites have figured this out, which is that you come into, it's a no-win scenario to be in an urban superintendent because there are just too many different interest groups pulling at you. No one's going to be happy. The controversies are going to stack up against you from day one. And so people who take the job, I believe, understand fully they're only going to be there for a little while. But usually it's a step up in pay, and it increases what their PERS retirement will be, their public employee retirement system, whatever that's called in your state. And so they dance through these positions, sort of taking the arrows until the pile becomes too high and it's time for them to move on. They walk out with a great retirement. They got paid a tremendous amount of money. And then another superintendent candidate simply dances in to take the spot. And the people who sit in these districts watch this. And of course, there's very little change that actually occurs. And the new person always gets to sort of a honeymoon and a reset of, I'm going to go on a listening tour and we're going to tackle these things. And if you live in these districts, you understand over the decades that very little changes. But these folks all enrich themselves. They all get paid very well and they get sweet retirements. CEOs are absolutely no different. Now, they may last a little longer, but they are absolute cowards because they're getting paid millions of dollars and they have all these stock options that they're waiting around to fully materialize. And so all they really want to do, it's sort of like when you go to a country western bar, they have that bull, that mechanical bull, and people get on it, and the contest is how long can you stay on that bull before it throws you off? And the guy turning the knob turns it up and up and up until finally you're thrown off. This is what it's like to be a CEO in America. They're all doing it for the money because they get paid so well. And the idea is you just try to stay on that Bronco for as long as you possibly can until it throws you off. But when it does, then you count the money. Whether you lasted 3 years or 10 years or 15 years, you made 20, 50, 150, 2 or 3 billion. It's a tremendous amount of money. And so the idea that any CEO is ever going to take a tough stand is ridiculous. This CEO for Google is absolutely no different. He's got all these cat ladies working for him, and they want this guy fired. And it's the easiest thing in the world among his elites and among his employees just to make the decision to fire the guy. Why would he ever stand on principle? Standing on principle comes at great personal and financial cost. And most of these people are only interested in enriching themselves. And if you look around, you can see this happening among elites. And, it doesn't have to just be school superintendents or high-tech CEOs. Look around at the elites in your world, and you'll see that the vast majority of them are simply going along to get along so that they can continue to cash very lucrative checks and float around in the airy circles. Cloud people. I have this idea in my mind that they have the courage of Chihuahuas. It's the phrase that always comes to mind. My mother had Chihuahuas, and what I remember about them is they shake. If you just look at a Chihuahua, it just sits there and shakes. And so when I look at all of these elites in these high-paid positions who rotate in and out and who always say whatever the perfectly PC thing is, they always just remind me of those little Chihuahuas. I have this phrase I use for the people that we unquestionably think are taking care of things around us and who project this aura of intelligence and invincibility. I call them the certified smart people. It's usually how I talk about government folks. But there's this constant projection of confidence, which is so phony. And I think if you're on the right, I would suggest that you look a little bit more askance at the military, because the military projects this as well. And I think that's where, on the right, we have a bit of a blind spot on this. But essentially, all of the levers of power in government project this idea of supreme confidence, even though if you just stop for a few seconds and think about it, the contrary evidence just stacks up around you. So think of the intelligence services who, through Hollywood movies and through their own proclamations, we're constantly convinced, or it's suggested that we be convinced that they are supremely confident. But these are the intelligence communities that had no idea the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And we spent billions of dollars penetrating the Soviet Union with our intelligence services, and they had absolutely no idea that that system was going to collapse, right? And then they're the ones that said it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. And an entire war was engaged on that premise. And then, just in the last 2 weeks, when North Korea fired off one of its missiles, the intelligence community issued a report saying that, it was a detail of what they believed North Korea's capabilities were as far as their rockets. Literally within 72 hours, the North Koreans had fired off a missile that had traveled farther than the assessment a few hours earlier had claimed they were capable of. So literally within 2 to 3 days, the intelligence communities were proven to be wrong on an assessment they had just made in the same week. And we spend a tremendous amount of money on this because we're told that other countries have vast intelligence services and we have to keep up and we have to spend all this money, and how it's absolutely vital. The work that they do is vital to our security. I have no doubt that they have some successes, and I have no doubt that they're using that the vast majority of what they know and what they share internally in the government basically comes from the signal work that they do. They have satellites all across the world, and they monitor phone calls, essentially intercept phone calls. And you can learn a lot and project a lot of confidence and pseudo-smarts if you were simply listening to everybody's phone calls. It's pretty easy to to convince people that you're super intelligent if you were listening to everybody's phone calls. Beyond that, I don't think that they accomplish a lot. But my point isn't really that they are all bad or just a bunch of idiots or all good and geniuses who never get it wrong. My point is that we are nowhere near as skeptical of the military or of the intelligence communities or any of these organs of government that would like to project these auras of confidence. And they get away with a lot. That's how the intelligence communities can push out this Russia hoax. Most people don't know that the idea that all 17 of the country's intelligence agencies agreed with that assessment, that's false. That report that Obama pushed out right before he left office was put out by 3 of the intelligence agencies, not 17. And even the New York Times has had to admit that when they published that it was incorrect. Also, most people don't know that Clapper and Brennan handpicked the employees within those 3 agencies who worked on that report. The vast majority of Americans do not know that. The 2 Obama cronies who were tasked with coming up with that assessment and its conclusions went into those 3 intelligence agencies and handpicked the employees who worked on this. Now, do you think they were Trump supporters?
I doubt it.
So they handpicked the people they knew would give them the result. Once you understand those 2 facts about the report, you understand that it was a con job and that it was something that these guys, using the aura of invincibility, using this aura that intelligence communities are nonpartisan, they crafted a report that was designed to push a narrative that's entirely false. And the vast majority of the people who work in the intelligence community came nowhere near that report. Matter of fact, that report, normally intelligence community assessments have to go through a multi-step process of review, kind of a peer review process in which it's shared with other agencies. This report did not go through that process. How many Americans know that? It's phony. But when the president says that intelligence agencies have concluded X, there's this aura of invincibility that stands behind those. Totally phony. Think of the CBO. The CBO, both the House and the Senate are forced to react to CBO estimates about how much a bill is going to cost, or when it comes to something like Obamacare, how many people are not going to be enrolled. Nearly every prediction that the CBO made about the original Obamacare bill is wrong. We've had almost 8 years under the bill now, and CBO estimates are usually about a 10-year period. They've been wildly wrong. And by the way, there are legions of examples of CBO reports that have been wildly wrong in predicting what would be the outcome. Now, by law, these assessments that the CBO makes essentially get tied to any bill that comes out, right? So those are the facts by law, even though they're not facts. And then, of course, the press goes absolutely ape if a CBO report says, well, 24 million people probably won't be enrolled it won't have insurance 10 years later after this bill that the Republicans pushed comes out. The press just goes wild as if that's gospel, even though all of the predictions of how many people would be enrolled under Obama were wildly wrong. The revenue projections, the debt impact projections within the CBO's report were all wildly wrong on the Obamacare bill, and yet they get treated as gospel. And a lot of what you read when you read that Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so dropped a bill, and when it got scored, it's going to drive up the debt by $50 billion, or it's going to cause 100 million people to go without lunch. Whatever the claim is, that's almost always coming from the CBO, and the CBO has a horrible track record of getting it right. This is simply a function of they need some agency to make a guess about their bills, so they've created the CBO to do that, and then by law, everything has to be scored in order to decide how it's going to impact the budget. It's completely phony. Magic is more real than the crap that goes on in this process. But again, this aura of invincibility gets projected by this agency, and people think, well, the CBO says that, because the press, the garbage press, never goes back and consistently re-reports on, by the way, update, the CBO projection on this bill that was passed by Congress is wildly wrong. Or if they do, it's buried, they do it once on page 19 at the back and they move on. They don't harp how many times have you heard that the Republican bill would cause 24 million people to not have insurance? Sometimes they lie and say it's going to unenroll 24 million people. The reality was the CBO said people would just choose not to get insurance. So some of them have been badgered and shamed into using the correct language. But the point is they harp and harp and harp on that number because they like that number, that phony number, and it's useful to them. And that's how it works. The CBO puts out phony numbers, and the liberal commanding heights uses the phony numbers they like and ignores the phony numbers that they don't. And this entire thing is just a game that's played in D.C. that has no actual impact on what the real debt numbers are or what the real insurance levels are, etc., etc. And I am just encouraging people to be a lot more skeptical when the military, even the military, where we have a weak spot on the right side of the spectrum, the military's claims are often wrong about what they can do or what they have done. And the CBO is almost always wrong. The intelligence communities are as often wrong as they are right.
That's scary.
And if you think about it, if I told you that I could predict things that would help you with your financial investments and all the key decisions in your life, and what I do is I flip a coin, and if it's heads, I tell you to go ahead, and if it's tails, I say no, you would get really mad if you made a bunch of life decisions and then found out I was simply flipping a coin. But if I tell you the intelligence communities are wrong as often as they're right, that's also basically a coin toss.
Yeah.
That means that 50% of the time, or 55, they're right or wrong in one direction, and then 45 or 55 right or wrong in the other direction, which means you could flip a coin and save billions of dollars and make decisions you might ask for advice from the intelligence community from. So it came out this week that a month ago, the FBI raided Paul Manafort's house. This is the Mueller investigation. I've been saying from the beginning that this should never have happened. I do blame Jeff Sessions for this, even though I love the man, and Mueller needs to be fired. But I want to make a different point. I want you to think about this investigation is a matter of weeks. I mean, it's only been going for a couple of months. We've seen Mueller hire about 17, 18 people into a person. They're all enemies of Trump. They're former Obama employees, they're Hillary Clinton donors, or they were never Trump Republicans. And look at the aggressiveness. Within a matter of months, this investigation has done a pre-dawn raid on Paul Manafort's house, who was one of Trump's campaign managers last year. I ask you to compare that to the Clinton email investigation from last year, which went on for months. How many pre-dawn raids of suspects' homes were there?
0.
Right. And two of the key suspects, two of the key employees for Secretary Clinton were given immunity.
Immunity from what, though?
Immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying. Now, almost always, that is done when somebody's going to give testimony that's going to help you indict someone else. So you basically trade off one indictment for somebody you think, a little fish for a bigger fish. That's essentially why somebody's given immunity. I can tell you for a fact that immunity is not given until they understand what's going to be said. Usually there's a lawyer-on-lawyer discussion, which is somewhat privileged, and the lawyer vaguely outlines that here's what my client may admit to if they're given immunity. And then the people making the immunity decision decide, okay, well, if they do say that, we will get a much bigger fish, and that's a prosecution we want, so yes, we will grant the immunity. No one ever just grants immunity because, well, you asked nicely. And so we decided, we thought about it, and you were so nice when you asked for immunity, so we decided yes. Prosecutors only give immunity, which they know forever protects that person from prosecution, when they believe 100% that they're going to get something better in return for that trade. That is, it's transactional every single time. But last year, two of Clinton's key employees were given immunity in exchange for their testimony. They then testified, and no one was ever charged with anything.
Yeah. Set a setup it was.
And then ultimately, the case was closed. Even though everyone who isn't a Clinton crony or just simply wants to be blind to that, just looking at the evidence that's available, she admitted that she used a server outside of the State Department system. We know for a fact that classified material passed through that server. So, without question, this is a violation of the law. Without question.
Not if the Clintons are involved.
And they didn't even say, look, we know this is a violation of the law, but we're not going to prosecute it. They just danced around the issue and made this claim. They pushed Comey out there to say that I don't believe any reasonable prosecutor would bring this case. Really? The same people who are doing pre-dawn raids on Paul Manafort's house?
Same people.
And the takeaway here, folks, is that there's no single system of justice. The system of justice that was employed last year under the Obama administration showed you what it's like when elites do not want to bring a guilty party to justice because they agree with them in some way or another, or they want to protect him. And what you're watching with the Mueller investigation is what happens when the elites do want a prosecution brought forward, when they want a president brought down. Yes, it's all part of this effort to deny a peaceful transition of power. It all goes back to Trump's election and the unwillingness of our elites in this country to allow a peaceful transition of power. Only the second time that that's happened in U.S. history. The first time was when Democrats from the South refused to accept the election of Abraham Lincoln as president of the United States. It was many months before they seceded. So it's not like they said on election day, that's it. There was a process, a slow-moving process of them pulling out of the Union because they refused to accept the outcome of the election. No one claimed that the election wasn't legitimate, that it hadn't been conducted in a fair way. They simply rejected the outcome and said, we will not participate in a peaceful transition to this person as president. That is what you've been seeing for the nearly a year now since Trump was elected. The Russian hacking claims, no one with a brain believes the Russians had any effect on the outcome. I don't even believe that they hacked the emails. I think it's a complete hoax and a lie. But the fact of the matter is that there's no one claiming that the outcome of the election would be changed. No one who isn't already set themselves on fire and run off a cliff and is irrelevant. The point is that this is not about saying that the election wasn't fair. They are slow motion, refusing to allow a peaceful transition of power to the duly elected president of the United States. And the Mueller investigation highlights this difference, this idea that the law for the elites, they have wormed their way into the fabric of and the machinery of our free society to such a point that they can manipulate it for their own outcomes.
Manipulate the justice system, really.
This is exactly what's happening. You don't really have a country anymore when the machinery of the federal government can be stopped, when someone can simply put a stick right into the wheels of it and say, no, it's not going to grind this person. And then those same people can simply pull the stick out of the machinery and say, yes, this person will be ground down. It makes a mockery of the whole idea of the blindfolded woman holding the scales. One of the basic principles in this country is that everybody has equal access to the courts and that all defendants have the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, and that rich or poor, everyone is subjected to the same judicial system and a jury of their peers. And what you're seeing with this manipulation of the federal investigative system is that the elites absolutely can protect themselves. Roman elites used to do this. They had a justice system in which they could be sued for bribery and the rest, but the people who served in the juries were all the same people you were going to charge with bribery, who were themselves taking bribes and had client states and everything else. So you could bring someone to trial, but they would almost always get acquitted by their friends, and then you would be run down like a dog for having done it. So people almost never brought bribery charges because you essentially outed yourself as an enemy of the plutocrats when you did that, and they would seek to destroy you, bringing their own charges against you if necessary, having you banished, and if all else failed, simply having you stabbed one night while you were walking down an alleyway, just eliminate you.
So being able to choose justices has really made our justice system dependent on whose own power.
Well, again, just like I was talking about earlier about how people project, there are these government organizations that project gravitas. One of the conceits that has allowed this country to function is the idea that there are these statesmen or these patriotic individuals who take their oath to be impartial very seriously, that the FBI director or that the attorney general, the key people who make the Justice Department work, are nonpartisan and that they apply the law equally to all. This is the crap you've been hearing in the last few months in defense of Mueller. He's former FBI director, and everybody in the elite sectors have been coming out to praise him. Don't worry, he's nonpartisan. Again, trying to hoax us, trying to push out this gravitas narrative of he's a man who takes this oath of impartiality seriously. Believe us when we tell you that it's impartial. Believe us when we tell you it's impartial. It's almost a hypnotic suggestion that they're pushing out there, even though if you just shake your head violently for a second and look at the decisions he's making, it's clear that he's not impartial. It is clear exactly what's happening, which is that these wheels are being used to grind down the duly elected president of the United States. But they've trained us over the centuries, decades and centuries to believe in this gravitas, in this impartiality, that these people who take these oaths they're better than us. They don't have any partisan axe to grind. And then we see Clinton Bill Clinton walk up the steps and have a private meeting with Loretta Lynch on a tarmac that no one would even know about if a local reporter hadn't been tipped off by an airport employee who drove by and took video through the fence wire, took video of Clinton coming up and having that meeting. No one would ever have known that the former president of the United States privately met with the attorney general who was investigating his wife. No one would have known that. And matter of fact, the emails that Judicial Watch and others have gotten from the Justice Department prove that they were scrambling then within 48 hours to come up with talking points on what the attorney general would say when asked about this meeting.
Oh, you mean they were talking about their grandchildren?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's Barbara Streisand. It's Barbara Streisand. Look, you see the evidence there, the tarmac visit, the fact that Comey is pushed out to say this strange thing about how he doesn't believe any reasonable prosecutor would bring a case. The FBI director doesn't make those decisions. Never in the past has the FBI director said, well, I don't know whether a prosecutor... Their job is just to collect the evidence. And then they present it to the folks at DOJ, and then DOJ makes a decision about whether they're going to prosecute or not. The FBI doesn't get involved in that decision-making process. Their job is just to collect the evidence. So he makes this strange, and then he makes another strange decision 7 or 8 days before the election, and then a day or two before clears her again. And it turns out he was a leaker. When Trump finally fires him, he immediately exposes how his leaks work and has this friend in a college who he leaks his memos to. Bit by bit, all the machinery has been exposed, and you can see how the swamp works. If you want to learn and see how they can make it seem legitimate, how they can dance just inside of the law, although they're really not dancing inside of the law. They're the ones who get to decide whether they're dancing inside of the laws.
That's precisely it.
So I wish I had better news on that, but I think the president needs to fire Mueller. And if he can't do that directly, if he needs to fire people at the DOJ, starting with Jeff Sessions, all the way down until he finds an employee who will get rid of Mueller, he needs to do that. Well, the press can call that a Saturday Night Massacre all they want, but you either see this for what it is or you don't. All of the mechanisms of DC and the elites are being turned on this president to void a legitimate election, and that must be thwarted, and that must be opposed, and that must be stopped by any means necessary.
So why hasn't Trump fired him yet?
Obviously, this is a decision that's going to cause a tremendous amount of backlash.
With whom exactly? I mean, the public isn't going to change their opinion of Trump. So who's going to cause backlash with? The non-Republican Republicans?
Certainly, although there are Trump supporters who have sided with Jeff Sessions against Trump, which absolutely makes no sense to me. And again, if you listen to my podcasts, you know, I absolutely love Jeff Sessions. I loved Jeff Sessions before Trump ran. Just to make the point again very quickly, Donald Trump's the person who actually ran for president of the United States. Donald Trump is the person who walked through fire. Everyone works for him. He's the only indispensable person. So I would love for Jeff Sessions to stay on. I need him to fight a lot more and to quit being a gentleman and playing by Queensberry's rules. And it wouldn't make me happy if Donald Trump fired Jeff Sessions. I would be sad about that. But nothing's going to break my support of the president in his decisions that he needs to make to implement the agenda he promised to implement. And if he believes he needs to make staffing changes, I haven't necessarily agreed with every staffing decision he's made, but you're not going to hear me wailing about that in public because ultimately it's not that big a deal. I would have preferred Jeff Sessions to be the Department of Homeland Security Secretary because I wanted him to focus on the immigration issue. Trump wanted him to be Attorney General, I think because Trump saw him as the most loyal person that he could appoint to that position. And it's Sessions who has failed to live up to that expectation by almost immediately recusing himself from the Russia investigation, which, in a couple of steps led to the Mueller appointment. So it's Jeff Sessions that has to unwind that. But at the end of the day, among Trump's staff, there are those I really like and those I'm not a big fan of, but it's Trump's decision. He's the person who's there every day. He understands this staff better than I do. I've never personally met Jeff Sessions. Donald Trump has. I've never personally met the people that are working for Donald Trump in the White House. Donald Trump has. So he knows who he needs where, and I trust him at the end of the day. So the Senate, after failing to do anything of consequence, went into recess. Although they didn't technically go into recess, they pulled this stunt, this maneuver where they have kind of pro forma sessions every couple of days. They gavel in while they're gone, so that they are not technically or legally in recess. Yes, recess. Why? This is because that the Constitution allows the president to recess appoint people. Donald Trump would have been able to fill hundreds of positions with recess appointments. So who stopped him?
The GOP.
Right. It's the Republicans that control the Senate. It's Mitch McConnell and the GOP, the Republican senators, who enacted this stunt to prevent the Republican president of the United States from doing recess appointments. I really need you to stop and think about that, folks, because the Democrats would never do that. The Democrats would never, ever block their own Democrat president of the United States from doing recess appointments. Never. And the Republicans just did this to our president of the United States. If you have any doubt that the Republicans need a thorough house cleaning, that's all the evidence. Don't listen to the platitudes and the things they say and the kumbaya and the pretenses. They literally blocked the Republican president from being able to appoint people into the administration. That is, politically, that is a hostile act. That is something an opposition party does, period. It is something that only an opposition party does. So the Republicans in the Senate exposed themselves to you as enemies of the President of the United States. Enemies.
So remember who they are when you're voting next.
So, of course, the senators serve 6-year terms, and many of the worst actors are not up for re-election. But we've talked about this on the podcast, and we're going to continue to talk about this on the podcast, about who can be targeted in this next election. And I've told you before, and I'm going to give you an update on our 3 RINOs that need to be removed. And those are Jeff Flake in Arizona, Dean Heller in Nevada, and Bob Corker in Tennessee. These are the 3 Republicans that we have identified who are coming up for re-election next year and who must be challenged by a strong Trump supporter in the primaries and taken out. And we've got good news on this front as far as updates go. Now, we already have Kelly Ward, who came very close to defeating John McCain last year. Kelly Ward is running against Jeff Flake. So we have a strong pro-Trump candidate there. Flake's numbers are dismal. We're going to need to do a lot to fundraise and to support her between now and that primary, but we are on a very good path to defeat Jeff Flake in his primary next year.
But that's in Arizona, right?
Correct. In Nevada, we have Dean Heller, and Danny Tarkanian, the son of the famous UNLV coach, is announced and running against Dean Heller in the Republican primary in Nevada. That was a very good development in the last week. We have our second position filled. Danny is an experienced politician. He's well known. He's got the right name. He will need money and support from those of you in Nevada, but that is a great candidate, and we are well on our way to defeating Dean Heller in the primary next year. That leaves only one position left unfilled. And we had this gentleman, Mark Green, announce this week that he would not be running against Bob Corker in Tennessee. Now, a little background. Mark Green was the Army Secretary nominee that Trump put up, and then he had to withdraw for certain reasons. He's been the one that a lot of Trump supporters have been waiting to announce, but as it turns out, Mark Green is a good friend of Bob Corker's, and so he announced this week that he would not be running. I suspect that Mark drew that out to benefit Bob, because the longer he was considered the front runner, the more that depressed any work by anyone else contemplating getting into the race. And so by delaying this announcement and only announcing this week that he's not running, he bought Bob Corker a lot of time and may have, tried to injure the budding campaigns of others. But there is still time to get a strong Trump supporter up and running against Bob Corker in Tennessee, and this must happen. This is the trifecta, the triumvirate that we need next year. We need to have 3 solid, strong Trump supporters running against these 3 RINOs, because their defeat will send an electric shock through the Senate. And there's a lot of people like Murkowski and Collins and others that we can't reach because they're not running next time. But when you take out, if we can and do take out 3 sitting Republican senators like that next year, you watch. The never-Trumpers will behave themselves. It's not like they're still not going to hate Trump, but they will start voting right and much more correctly, and you will hear a lot less from them because everyone running in 2020 will get their mind focused immediately. The moment those 3 are defeated next year in 2018, all of the Republicans who were up for election in 2020 will instantly snap to attention because their reelection campaigns start on that day. And it's just 2 years away, and they know that we're coming for them at that point. So, yes, there are some downsides to the fact that it takes a while to fix the Senate, but you don't necessarily have to take the heads of the worst actors to get the changes that you need. It's a very exclusive little club, 100 people who wake up every day and look in the mirror and see the next president of the United States. The egos are giant. And I'll tell you the one overriding principle of people who get elected to the Senate, they never want to leave. It's like being elected the Prince of Wales. And this little exclusive club where you get to wear a shiny uniform and everybody calls you nice names, and you are one of an elite. You're one of only 100 people in the country who have this immense power and prestige. They don't want to give it up.
They have all this power and they don't have to be president and take as many slings and arrows. And they simply change their dialogue depending on what group they're speaking to. And so they can be everything to everyone.
And they're very sophisticated grifters. You don't get to those positions usually without being very, especially the people who stay. There are some people that rotate into the Senate for a term or 2 and then leave. Those are usually the decent human beings, the demints and others, because they don't want to spend a career having to say or do whatever it takes to stay there. They would like to have some principles, so they roll off. I'm thinking of Frist, who was in Tennessee. Eventually they like to go back. It's a mark of character that a person can achieve that eliteness, that selectivity, and then willingly give it up. It's very similar to what George Washington did when he chose not to become the king of this country, and he like Cincinnatus in Roman history, just gave it up and walked away. It's the mark of strong character, and every now and again you see a senator do that. Just say, 1 or 2 terms is fine. I don't want to do this forever. The ones who sit there clinging to it, the Mitch McConnells, the Ron Wydens, and the rest, there's nothing else they could imagine themselves doing. Being seen as a United States senator defines them. It's the only thing that matters. And they are the power-hungry monsters. But as I said, you don't necessarily have to defeat all of them. They are susceptible to tremors. They feel the shockwaves, and when someone in their elite club is taken out and executed by the mob, guillotined politically, they see it, and they absolutely change course. They make course corrections to ensure that their own boat will arrive, back at the dock safely. This is Matt using 100 analogies in one sentence. So we're well on our way. We have 2 out of the 3 we need, but those of you in Tennessee, we need a strong challenger against Bob Corker. There's still work to be done, and we'll keep you updated on that.
Well, I don't know. The only one that I can think of that's really, really popular in Tennessee right now is Marcus Mariota on the football team.
Probably not willing to run for the Senate right at this moment. I want to read this quote from 538, the useless polling outfit that was very successful in the 2014 elections, and so they got kind of anointed with a crown, and everybody assumed that they could do no wrong. They were queen for a day or for an election cycle, and they were considered basically Mount Olympus in their projections. And they got absolutely everything in the election wrong last year. I mean, they were wrong about Trump from day one. And they ate some humble pie, but they've gone back to, they make a living off of doing polling and predictions. So, and it's all based on statistics. They do a lot of statistical modeling. And this paragraph from 538 caught my attention in an article that came out this week. It says, even if Democrats were to win every single 2018 House and Senate race for seats representing places Hillary Clinton won or that Trump won by less than 3 percentage points, which is a pretty good midterm by historical standards, the Democrats could still fall short of a House majority and lose 5 Senate seats. Now, knowing that 538 is certainly got a reputation for being wrong as often as they're right. The point essentially is that based on who's up for re-election, which seats are up for re-election, and the demographics of those states based on how they voted for Trump and Clinton, it is almost impossible for the Republicans to lose the Senate. Now, maybe we're jinxing them and they'll go and do that. Based on their production so far, it's not much of a loss. But the point being that this is why you see a lot of GOP senators acting the way they are, because they don't believe they're going to lose their power in the next cycle, and they are unafraid. But I say the flip side of that is that we, as Tea Partiers, as Trump supporters, we don't have to be afraid of costing the party or the anti-left majorities in Congress. We get a free shot at these guys in their primaries, because if we go after Jeff Flake and Dean Heller and Bob Corker, we're not going to lose the Senate, no matter who we nominate. You got Mitch McConnell scaring everybody about, the Tea Party's going to nominate witches again, like they did back in 2012 and 2014. But I would argue that even if we did nominate witches, we're not going to lose the Senate. And that's the flip side of this argument. We have a free shot in 2018 to try to clean up this caucus and go after some members. And pretty much no matter what happens, it's almost a sure thing the Republicans are going to pick up some seats, because there are these 10 Democrats in Trump states that have to run for re-election, and they're just not all going to make it. They just aren't. So whether we win 2 or 3 or whether we win 4 or 5, at the end of the day, the 52 number is going to be, at worst case scenario, 52, maybe 53, 54, 55. It's going to be somewhere in that vicinity. It's probably not going to reach 60, which would be another magic number we would like to have, but it's not going to fall below 50 and go to 49. So once you understand that no matter what happens, it's going to be somewhere in that sort of safe zone where we have enough votes to control the chamber, but we don't have 60, that's a free opportunity to go after some of these rhinos and knock them out. Everybody needs to be concentrated like a laser on these handful of races. We can't be off on 150 different races trying to accomplish, spreading ourselves so thin that we can't accomplish these goals. A few focused political executions are going to get us what we need. There's a lot of talk of secession, both on liberals in California and certainly on the anti-left side, whether it's Texas or others, talking about wanting to secede. I know this all seems like talk right now, but I would make the argument that, secession talk started very early on the first time. And it took about 30 or 40 years before it actually happened. But it did happen. And then we had to fight a war over that issue. I think it's for a topic for another podcast on what I think would happen if secessions actually began to occur. I don't believe we would have as the bloody civil war that we had the first time, and I'll happily explain that in another podcast. But for this one, I just want to make the point that just because the talk is early and sporadic doesn't mean we aren't on a slow gliding path towards an eventual secession point. It may be a decade or two away, but I see everything lining up for it. I think at this point, I see us on that path, and I don't see the deviation point. A lot of what kept this country together were unifying principles, and we no longer have an agreement on those principles. We have an entire party dedicated to an entirely different interpretation of the Constitution. So we have 2 constitutions in the United States right now. And depending on who's in power, one of those constitutions is implemented during that period. And then when the other party comes to power, the other constitution is implemented. So that's an untenable situation over time. The principles are no longer unifying. We used to have activities that unified us. If you think about the Western expansion in this country, or opposing the European powers trying to dominate in North and South America. The Monroe Doctrine. These were unifying principles for the American people early on. World War I and World War II were unifying activities. I'm sorry, not principles, but unifying activities. The Cold War, again, was a unifying activity. It doesn't always have to be an enemy, but it has to be something that gives everybody in America a unified sense of purpose, that we're all trying to accomplish a certain goal. The last time this country did anything like that was the space exploration program, where we went to the moon. And it ignited the imagination. It thrilled Americans in that we achieved something that no one else had. We did this incredible thing. A bunch of people had to work together to get it done. It was a unifying activity. Even though most Americans were not actually involved, they were emotionally involved in that unifying activity. And it has been a long time. We've had a couple of military engagements since then, but the effect has been very temporary as far as its unifying effect. And my argument would be that a country that does not have unifying principles and does not have unifying activities will not stay together for very long, especially a country that's as disparate as this one is, spread out, expansive, and 330 million people and growing larger. Without some kind of a glue, it will break apart. Now, that may not happen for a couple of decades, but I believe very firmly that we're in the lane and we are headed there. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I don't see the unifying activities or principles, the kinds of glue that keeps a country together. I don't see them at all.
If North Korea decides to send a missile over to California, do you think that would be unifying?
I don't think so. I think it would fall under the same sort of rubric as the sort of temporary events of the invasion of Iraq and the original Iraq war to free Kuwait. These military engagements tend to be very unifying, but it's very short-lived effect. It's a matter of months. And then ultimately, all the pacifists, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pushback. And everybody retreats to their sides, and the right blames Obama and Clinton for the fact that it got this far, and the left will go crazy about Trump being a warmonger and he brought this on us. So it doesn't take very long for people to end up back on their camps. And yes, so do I think when that missile's actually flying and if we shoot it down, for instance, that'd be a tremendous hooray moment for the accomplishment. There would be a lot of military celebrations around that, and it will feel like we're unified. But I am old enough and wise enough now that I've seen that dissipate too many times to believe that it will endure. I believed after 9/11 that we were seeing a unifying activity that was going to bring America together. But once the Democrats actually lost seats in the 2002 election, which was the first time in recent history that the out party had lost seats to the new president's party, they realized that the anti-terrorism sentiment, that the war footing that Republicans were on was politically death for them. So they just made a political calculation that they were going to be against all this stuff in order to get themselves back into power. And it only took them a couple of cycles to get there, and by 2006 they were. By essentially being anti-patriots, by tearing at the fabric of this country, by ruining the long-term prospects of the country, they gained their short-term goals, which is pretty much what the Democrat Party's been doing from its existence. My point being, though, that they took something that I thought was an obvious unifying principle, 3,000 Americans murdered, and our need to adjust conditions in the world so that would not happen again, and they undermined it until they had completely decimated it, until whatever gains we'd actually made had been completely given away, and soldiers' sacrifices had been given away. And when you think about how despicable that is, to betray people who've been maimed or who have lost their lives in advancement of political and military goals, to give that away. And of course, this is what the Democrats did in Vietnam as well. So they're very practiced at this. But again, all of which makes the point that I don't see the unifying principles, I don't see the unifying activities that would allow us to long endure as a unified country. It's not necessarily the happiest note to end on. We're just about out of time. You can find this podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud and Stitcher and Pocket Cast. I do want to do a shout out of congratulations to Disobedient Media for coming out recently with some great reporting on the Russian hoax and why the DNC hacks were actually an inside job. That story is still developing, but we're very proudly associated with Disobedient Media, and congratulations to them and their staff. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow, so I'm hoping that you'll share this with just one friend. Get them hooked on it like you are. And please like and review our show on whatever app or service you're listening to it on. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.